There is a person watching this right now who has spent their entire life feeling things they cannot explain. Not ordinary feelings, heavy ones, feelings that arrive before the conversation even begins. Feelings that linger for hours after the other person has already forgotten the exchange. A grief that seems to belong to no particular moment. A guilt that has no clear crime attached to it. This person has been told they are too sensitive, that they feel too much, that they should toughen up, build walls, stop absorbing the world like an open wound absorbs air. But no one has ever told them the true reason they feel this way. No one has explained what Carl Jung understood and what modern psychology has never quite found the language to say directly, that some people are not simply sensitive, they are carrying something, something that does not belong to them, something that was placed there, not with cruelty, not with intent, but with the invisible mechanic of the unconscious, by the people around them who could not carry it themselves. Jung called this process participation mystique, the merging of psychic boundaries between one person and another, the state in which the soul of one human being becomes entangled with the shadow material of another, and takes it in, absorbs it, holds it, suffers under it, and calls it their own. This video is about that person. It is about the 13 signs that you are not simply feeling too much. You are carrying a weight that was never yours to carry. And the path forward is not to feel less. It is to finally understand what you have been holding. If this kind of depth speaks to something inside you, something that has been waiting to be named, consider subscribing to this channel. Leave a like on this video so that others who are carrying what is not theirs might find their way here too. You have been in rooms where nothing was said, and yet you walked out exhausted. You have sat across from people who smiled and made conversation and said all the right words. And something in you knew that beneath the surface, something was wrong. Something dark and unacknowledged moved beneath their pleasantness like a current beneath still water, and your body registered it before your mind could translate it into thought. You have ended relationships or watched relationships end, and found yourself grieving not just the loss, but something stranger, a kind of relief you were ashamed of, as if a pressure had been lifted from inside your chest, as if you had been holding your breath for years and suddenly, in the absence, could breathe again. You have been the person others confide in, always the one they call in the middle of the night, the one who listens without judgment, without running, without making it about themselves. And you have felt, in those moments, both chosen and used, without being able to say why, without being able to explain the peculiar loneliness that lives at the center of being needed. You have wondered, in your quietest moments, where you end and other people begin. That is not a question people ask lightly. That is the question that lives at the core of what Jung understood about a very specific kind of psychic architecture. The architecture of the person who, through temperament or trauma or both, developed a psyche that is not walled in the way most people's psyches are. A psyche that is, in the most precise Jungian sense, permeable. And permeability, in a world full of people who cannot face their own shadows, is not simply a gift, it is a danger. This video will not tell you that your sensitivity is a superpower. It will not instruct you to embrace it and build a brand around it and monetize your capacity for suffering. This video will tell you the truth that Jung spent decades trying to map, the truth that is both harder and ultimately more liberating than anything the self-help world has ever offered you. You are carrying shadows, and the first step toward freedom is learning to recognize which ones are yours and which ones never were. Before moving through the 13 traits, it is necessary to understand the architecture that makes any of this possible, because without the framework, The traits remain surface-level patterns, and surface-level patterns do not set anyone free. Jung's model of the psyche was not simple. He did not divide the inner life into conscious and unconscious and call the work done. His cartography was more ambitious, more disturbing, and ultimately more honest than that. He understood that every human being carries a shadow, the repository of everything the ego cannot accept about itself, the impulses deemed unworthy, the hungers deemed shameful, the rage that was never permitted to speak, the grief that was never permitted to be acknowledged. All of this accumulates in the unconscious, not dissolved, not gone, merely hidden, waiting. And here is what the comfortable versions of Jungian psychology tend to minimize. The shadow does not stay quietly inside the person who cannot face it. It moves, it seeks a vessel, it finds. Through the unconscious mechanisms, Jung described with almost frightening precision another psyche willing to receive it. Another person whose boundaries are sufficiently open that the shadow material can be placed there. Through the process Jung called projection and carried by that person instead. The projector feels relieved, lighter, as if they have simply moved the weight to another room. The carrier, the one who absorbs what was projected, experiences something they cannot explain, a sudden heaviness, an emotion that seems too large for the situation, a darkness that descended without a visible cause. Jung called the extreme form of this participation mystique, a term he borrowed from the anthropologist Lucien Lévy-Bruhl. Mystical participation, a state in which the subject cannot clearly distinguish themselves from the object, a state in which two psyches become so entangled that one person begins to live the unlived inner life of another. This is not metaphor, this is psychic mechanics. And there is a particular type of person, a particular psychic structure that is most vulnerable to it, not the weakest people, not the most damaged people. Often, paradoxically, some of the most perceptive and internally developed people. People whose nervous systems were calibrated from a very young age to read the emotional weather of a room with extraordinary precision. People who learned, because they had to, because their survival in some sense depended on it, to feel what others felt before those others had, acknowledged it themselves. These are the people Jung might have recognized as carrying the seed of what he called the wounded healer archetype, the figure in mythology associated with Chiron, the centaur who could heal all others, and yet could not heal his own wound, the one whose greatest gift grew directly from the place of deepest injury. But that archetype, before it becomes a source of genuine wisdom, must first pass through a period of unconscious servitude, a period in which the gift is not a gift at all, it is a burden, a period in which the sensitivity is not sovereign, it is enslaved. That is the period these 13 traits describe. The first trait is this: you feel emotions in your body before you understand them in your mind, not a vague intuition, a physical event, a tightening in the chest when someone speaks in a particular tone, a nausea that rises when you walk into a particular house, a fatigue that arrives not from physical exertion, but from spending an hour in the presence of someone whose inner world is in turmoil. Even if that turmoil was never named, never mentioned, never acknowledged by anyone in the room. Jung wrote extensively about what he called the somatic unconscious, the way in which psychic contents that cannot be consciously processed are expressed through the body. What he described in clinical language, the shadow carrier lives every day without clinical language, without a map, without the vocabulary to explain why the body becomes a seismograph for psychic events occurring inside another person. The standard psychological reading of this trait is that it indicates emotional sensitivity. And that is not incorrect, but it is incomplete. What it actually indicates, in the Jungian framework, is that the boundary between the self and others, what Jung called the differentiation of the ego from the collective, was never fully established, not because of weakness, often because of necessity. Because in an environment where emotional truth was suppressed, or denied, or weaponized, the child who would become this adult learned to read the body before words, to feel the storm before it broke, to absorb the atmosphere before it became explicit. The body learned to be a receiver, and receivers, once tuned to a frequency, do not simply switch off. This is the foundation on which all 13 traits rest: the permeable boundary, the receiving body, the psyche that was trained, before it knew it was being trained, to carry what others could not hold. The second trait is that exhaustion follows you out of social situations that should not be tiring. Not all social situations, not the ones where people are genuinely present, genuinely open, genuinely engaging. Those can be energizing. The exhaustion arrives in specific conditions. When something in the room is unspoken, when there is a performance underway. Pleasantness over tension, cheerfulness over grief, composure over barely contained rage. When the emotional atmosphere of a gathering is dramatically different from what is being said aloud. In those conditions, the shadow carrier does something no one asked them to do, and no one thanked them for doing. They hold the gap. They metabolize the dissonance between what is being expressed and what is actually present in the room. They process, in their own nervous system, the emotional reality that everyone else is managing to ignore. Jung described the participation mystique as a state in which the unconscious is projected outward and identified with the external world. But the inverse is equally true. In the shadow carrier, the unconscious of the external world is projected inward, taken inside the carrier's own psyche, and experienced as if it originated there. The exhaustion is not weakness. It is the cost of a very specific kind of unconscious labor. Labor that was never requested, never acknowledged, and never compensated. Because the people who benefit from it are almost never aware it is happening. The third trait is a profound difficulty knowing what you actually want. This one is perhaps the most quietly devastating. You can feel what others want with extraordinary clarity. You can sense the need behind the request, the hunger beneath the politeness, the wound motivating the behavior. You calibrate yourself to others with a precision that borders on the uncanny. And yet, when someone turns to you and asks simply, directly, "What do you want? What do you need? What would make you happy?" Silence. Not the silence of someone considering carefully. The silence of someone who genuinely does not know, who has spent so long calibrating to others that the inner signal, the direct transmission from self to awareness, has been drowned out, overridden, functionally lost. The concept of the persona is relevant here. The persona is the mask the psyche constructs to interface with the social world. Every person has one. It becomes dangerous only when the persona and the self become confused, when the person believes the mask is the face, when adaptation to the outer world becomes so total that the inner life can no longer make itself heard. In the shadow carrier, the persona is built not around self-presentation but around service, around receptivity, around the function of receiving and holding what others cannot face. The persona says, "I am the one who understands. I am the one who does not burden anyone. I am the one who feels your pain and asks for nothing in return." And the self, the deep center of genuine selfhood that Jung placed at the core of the individuation process, waits, quietly, buried beneath the weight of everyone else's shadows, sending signals that never quite make it to the surface. The person who does not know what they want has not lost themselves to laziness or confusion. They have lost themselves to a lifetime of carrying what others could not. The fourth trait is a recurring sense of guilt, with no traceable origin. It arrives on ordinary mornings. It settles like weather. It does not announce its cause. It simply sits inside the chest, heavy and persistent, suggesting, without evidence, without argument, that something is wrong, that something has been failed, that some obligation, unnamed and perhaps unnameable, has not been met. The psychological literature tends to attribute this to internalized criticism, early conditioning, the voice of a demanding parent, and those factors are real. But in the Jungian framework, there is something additional happening. When a person consistently absorbs the shadow material of others, the unacknowledged guilt, the projected self-contempt, the unconscious shame of those around them, that material does not remain neutrally stored. It activates. It produces emotional experiences indistinguishable from the carrier's own inner life. The guilt that was never owned by the person who generated it now lives inside someone who had no part in creating it. This is one of the most psychically violent aspects of the participation mystique that no one talks about with sufficient directness. The shadow carrier does not simply feel other people's pain. They feel other people's guilt, other people's shame sheet, other people's self-contempt. The material that the projector has refused to integrate has, in fact, actively expelled from their own consciousness, lands inside another person and is experienced as if it always belonged there. The guilt with no traceable origin very often has a traceable origin. It simply does not originate in the carrier. The fifth trait is the compulsive need to resolve tension in any room you enter. Before a word is spoken, before the tension has been acknowledged or named, the shadow carrier is already working, already making themselves smaller, brighter, more accommodating, already searching for the tone, the word, the gesture that will ease the pressure they can feel building in the atmosphere around them. This is not kindness, or not only kindness. It is something older and more urgent than kindness. It is a survival mechanism. Jung understood that the psyche does not simply seek pleasure and avoid pain in the simple behaviorist sense. The psyche seeks wholeness, and when the environment in which a child develops is one in which the expression of conflict or darkness is dangerous, where a parent's rage is unpredictable, where a family's stability depends on the suppression of negative emotion, where the child learns that the atmosphere of the home can shift from safety to threat without warning, the child develops what might be understood as an early and involuntary form of shadow management. They become the regulator of the emotional environment, the one who absorbs the tension before it becomes catastrophe, the one who reads the signs early enough to intervene, the one who reshapes themselves again and again into whatever form is required to keep the room from breaking. And this skill, this terrible and remarkable skill, does not disappear when the dangerous environment is left behind. It follows. It activates in every room, every relationship, every gathering where the emotional weather is complicated. The compulsion to resolve tension is not a character flaw. It is a record of something that once had to happen in order to be safe. The sixth trait is an inexplicable attraction to people who are suffering, not just compassion for suffering people, an attraction, a pull, a sense of recognition when encountering someone in pain that feels like coming home, as if pain is the language in which you are most fluent and encountering it in another person is the first conversation in days that feels fully real. This is where the wounded healer archetype begins to make itself felt. Marie-Louise von Franz, Jung's closest colleague and one of the most perceptive analytical psychologists of the 20th century, said that the wounded healer is the archetype of the self, of our wholeness, the divine within, and is at the bottom of all genuine healing procedures. The wound is not incidental to the healer's gift. The wound is the gift, the access point, the place of entry into genuine understanding of another person's suffering. But here is the complexity that von Franz and Jung both understood, and that the popular empath literature almost entirely ignores. The wounded healer archetype, when it operates unconsciously, when the carrier has not yet undertaken the individuation process and recognized what they are living, does not produce healing. It produces a cycle, a repetition. The shadow carrier is drawn to suffering people because suffering is the frequency they were tuned to earliest, because in the relationship with a suffering person, they recognize their role. They know what is required. The uncertainty of ordinary relating, the mutual exposure, the balanced exchange, the vulnerability of not knowing who you are to another person is replaced by the comfortable clarity of the designated healer dynamic. I carry your pain. You need me to carry your pain. And in this arrangement, no one has to look directly at what is actually happening between us. The attraction to suffering is not pathological in its origins, but it can become a prison if it is never examined. The seventh trait is difficulty receiving care without feeling profoundly uncomfortable. Others can give care. They know how to do that. They have built entire identities around knowing how to do that. But when care is directed at them, when someone notices their pain, when someone asks with genuine attention how they are doing, when someone offers to hold the weight for once, something in the body contracts, a tightness, an urge to deflect, an almost reflexive movement toward, I'm fine before the question is even fully landed. This is one of the most revealing signs of the unconscious shadow carrier, because it points directly to the psychic structure underneath. The role of carrier, of the one who holds, who absorbs, who receives the shadow material of others, is not simply a habit. It is an identity, a deep persona, an unconscious understanding of who one is and what one is for. And within that identity, being cared for is not simply uncomfortable, it is disorienting, because it requires occupying a different position entirely. It requires being for a moment the one who needs, the one who is seen in their vulnerability rather than their usefulness, the one who receives rather than absorbs. Jung wrote that what is not made conscious appears in our lives as fate. The shadow carrier who cannot receive care will, by an iron logic they did not choose, continue to find themselves in relationships where the dynamic of giving and receiving is profoundly imbalanced, because that imbalance is familiar. Because the psyche, until it is asked to examine itself, moves always in the direction of the known. The inability to receive is not a character trait, it is the shape of a psychic wound. The eighth trait is a recurring dream of being buried, submerged, or crushed under weight. Dream symbolism was central to Jung's entire clinical and theoretical project. He understood dreams not as wish fulfillment in the Freudian sense, but as messages conscience, communications from the deeper layers of the psyche to the ego, often expressed in the archetypal imagery of the collective unconscious. When the shadow carrier dreams of being buried, pressed under earth, submerged in dark water, crushed beneath a weight they cannot name or lift, the unconscious is not producing random imagery. It is describing, assists with a precision the waking mind might resist, the actual psychic condition of the dreamer. The weight in the dream is the accumulated shadow material being carried. The earth is the density of what has been absorbed from others and internalized as personal. The dark water is the participation mystique itself, the undifferentiated merger between self and other. The loss of psychic boundaries that Jung associated with states of unconscious identification. These dreams are not nightmares in the ordinary sense. They are diagnoses. They are the unconscious saying, with the only language available to it, something is pressing on you that should not be there. Something has accumulated that was not meant to stay. the weight is real, and you have been carrying it long enough. The shadow carrier, who begins to pay attention to these dreams, who begins to treat them not as disturbances but as messages, has taken the first step toward what Jung called the individuation process, the slow, difficult, irreplaceable work of becoming who one actually is. The ninth trait is an almost allergic response to conflict between other people. Even conflict that has nothing to do with you. Witnessing an argument between two strangers produces a physical reaction. Overhearing raised voices in the next room, even in a context that poses no threat, sends something spiking through the nervous system. Sitting at a table where two people are in tension, not arguing openly, simply tense, simply radiating the unspoken friction of unresolved conflict, can ruin an entire evening. This is frequently described in the popular literature on empaths as sensitivity. And again, that framing, while not entirely wrong, misses the Jungian depth available here. What is actually happening in the framework of the shadow carrier is that the psyche is responding not simply to the external event, but to the shadow content that conflict reveals. Open conflict is the moment when shadows surface, when people say, in anger, what they have been unable to say in composure. When the unconscious material of two people breaks through the surface of the personas and becomes, as for a terrible moment, visible, and the shadow carrier, whose entire psychic system is calibrated to receive exactly this kind of material, is flooded, not simply by the emotional intensity, by the content, by the specific flavors of shadow, the projected self-contempt, the old wounds being reenacted, the unexpressed grief that has curdled into rage, that pour out of two people in conflict and move through the room like weather. The allergic reaction is not oversensitivity. It is the response of a system that was never equipped with an adequate filter. The 10th trait is a tendency to know things about people that you were never told. You knew before the announcement. You felt the shift in someone's inner life before they themselves had fully acknowledged it. You sensed the lie beneath the story, the grief beneath the performance, the love beneath the indifference, not by logic, not by deduction, but by a direct transmission. You cannot explain and have learned not to mention because mentioning it makes people uncomfortable. Jung's concept of the collective unconscious is essential here. Jung understood that beneath the personal unconscious, the individual repository of repressed experience and forgotten memory, there lies a deeper stratum of the psyche that is shared across humanity. The collective unconscious, the repository of archetypal patterns, mythics, structures, and psychic material that belongs not to any individual but to the species itself. The shadow carrier, whose psychic boundaries are permeable, has access to this layer in a way that more psychically bounded individuals typically do not. The permeability that makes them vulnerable to absorbing others' shadows also makes them permeable to the deeper currents of the collective, unconscious itself. They feel the archetypal patterns at work beneath the surface of individual lives with a sensitivity that, when properly understood and carefully integrated, is genuinely extraordinary. But before integration, before individuation, this access is not a gift. It is a source of confusion because the information arrives without context, without filter, without the ego structures that would allow it to be organized and interpreted. It simply comes. And the carrier is left to make sense of it alone. The 11th trait is a specific and recurring experience that might be called grief without a name, a sadness that is not located in any particular loss, a mourning that precedes the event, an ache that arrives on beautiful days, in peaceful moments, in circumstances where there is, by any reasonable assessment, nothing to be sad about. This grief baffles people. It baffles the shadow carrier themselves. It resists the ordinary consolations. It does not respond to reasoning or to the assurance that things are, in fact, fine, because it is not grief about circumstances. It is the grief of the psyche that has lived too long at a remove from its own center. The grief of the self, Jung's term for the deepest organizing principle of the psyche, the totality of conscious and unconscious together, for the life that has not yet been lived, the life that has been postponed, diverted, given away in the service of carrying what others could not hold. This grief is not pathology. In the Jungian framework, it is something closer to a summons. The psyche does not mourn randomly. It mourns what it knows at some level deeper than conscious thought has been lost or abandoned or indefinitely deferred. The grief without a name is the grief of an unlived life, and the fact that it is felt, that the system is sensitive enough to register it at all, is not a sign of damage. It is a sign that something essential is still alive inside, still waiting, still unwilling to give up on what the carrier was always meant to become. The 12th trait is the experience of being drained by certain people with a precision that goes far beyond ordinary social fatigue. There are specific people, often the same people repeatedly, across months and years, in whose presence a particular kind of emptying occurs. Not the general fatigue of social interaction, not the tiredness that comes from a long evening of genuine engagement. A targeted depletion, a feeling of having been extracted from, as if something was taken that you did not offer. Jung's framework of projection provides the structural explanation. The people who produce this specific exhaustion are almost invariably people who are carrying significant unintegrated shadow material and who have, unconsciously, without malice, but with the relentless efficiency of the unconscious, identified in the shadow carrier someone willing to receive what they cannot hold. The projection is not a single event. It is a sustained relationship dynamic. The projector continues to externalize their shadow content, their unacknowledged guilt, their repressed grief, their refused vulnerability, and the carrier continues to absorb it, process it, metabolize it through their own nervous system. The transaction happens entirely below the level of conscious awareness on both sides. The projector does not know they are doing it. The carrier does not know they are receiving it. And yet the dynamic is as real, as consistent, and as measurable in its effects as any physical exchange of energy. The inexplicable depletion in the presence of specific people is not mysterious. It is the cost of a psychic transaction that one party is performing without the knowledge or consent of either party involved. The 13th trait, and in many ways the most significant, is a deep, persistent sense that your emotional life is somehow more than your own, that what you feel exceeds what your own biography, your own story, your own particular experiences could fully account for. You have felt sorrows too ancient for your years, fears that do not correspond to anything in your personal history, longings that seem to reach backward through time, towards something you cannot name, moments of grief or joy, so disproportionate their immediate triggers that they feel for a fleeting and unsettling second as if they belong to someone or something larger than yourself. This experience, which the shout carrier often dismisses as evidence of their own disordered psychology, is in the Jungian framework one of the most important signs that something profound is trying to awaken. Jung understood the human psyche as continuous, not only backward through personal history, but backward through what he called the phylogenetic layers of the unconscious. The emotional material available to the sufficiently permeable psyche is not limited to personal experiences. It includes the accumulated emotional residue of generations, the unlived grief of ancestors, the compressed suffering of family systems across decades, the mythic and archetypal emotional patterns that belong to the collective. unconscious itself. The empath who feels more than seems personally warranted is not delusional. They are receiving transmissions from depths they have not yet learned to navigate. This is the territory where the twice-born archetype begins to stir. Jung's concept of the twice-born, drawn from William James and rooted in the initiatory traditions of cultures across the world, describes those individuals for whom a single birth, a single passage through ordinary social development is not sufficient, who must undergo a second birth, a descent into the depths of the psyche, a confrontation with the shadow, with the unlived life, with the full weight of what has been carried, followed by an emergence that is not a return to the person they were before, but the arrival of someone genuinely new. The emotional excess, the feeling of carrying more than one life's worth of weight, is not the symptom of damage. It is the pressure of a second birth beginning to build. And now, having named the 13, the question that must be asked: what do you do with this? Jung's answers was never simple. It was never a 10-step program or a checklist or a technique to be applied between Tuesday's obligations and Thursday's anxieties. His answer was a process, the process he devoted his life to mapping and named individuation. The Latin root of individuation is individuus, undivided. To individuate is not to become isolated, it is to become, for the first time, genuinely whole. To bring into conscious relationship the parts of the psyche that have been living in the dark, the shadow, the unlived desires, the authentic self buried beneath the persona, and to integrate them. Not dissolve them, not master them, integrate them. For the shadow carrier, individuation begins with a single act that is both deceptively simple and extraordinarily difficult. The act of differentiation, of beginning to ask, in each moment of emotional flooding, each wave of inexplicable feeling, each episode of the grief without a name or the guilt without a crime, is this mine? Not as a rejection of what is felt, not as a wall being built, but as a genuine inquiry, a beginning of the consciousness that distinguishes between the material generated by the carrier's own psyche and the material projected onto them from outside. This is not something that happens overnight. Jung spent decades on this work in his own psyche, documented in the extraordinary record of the Red Book. His first confrontation with the unconscious, the document he kept hidden for nearly a century because he understood that most of the world was not ready to see what genuine psychological depth looks like from the inside. But the work begins with recognition. It begins with watching this video and feeling something shift in the chest. A sense of finally being accurately described, finally being seen not in the soft light of flattery, but in the specific illumination of truth. It begins with understanding that the weight you have been carrying was never entirely yours, and that you were never meant to carry it forever. This is where the archetype of the wounded healer becomes something other than a burden. Jung understood that the wound is not incidental to the healer's gift, the access to suffering that the shadow carrier has developed. The permeability, the depth of feeling, the capacity to be present in darkness without flinching. These qualities, when they emerge from unconscious servitude into conscious intention, become something the world genuinely needs, something that cannot be taught in graduate programs or developed through technique. It is the knowledge that comes only from having carried the darkness and survived, from having lived for years or decades in the space between another person's shadow and their unwillingness to face it, and from having finally set that weight down. Marie-Louise von Franz understood this with an almost ruthless clarity. The wounded healer is the archetype of the self, not of the perfect, untroubled, luminous self that popular spirituality tends to offer. The self that carries the whole of its experience, wound and wisdom, shadow and light, and is, because of that wholeness genuinely present in a way that no amount of technique can replicate. The shadow carrier who begins to individuate is not becoming someone who no longer feels. They are becoming someone who feels without being owned by what they feel. Someone who can enter the room where others are suffering and remain, for the first time, fully themselves, present without being absorbed, available without being consumed, accompanying others through the darkness without disappearing into it. This is not the end of sensitivity. It is the beginning of its sovereignty. There is a passage in Jung's writings from the collected works, the dense and magnificent record of a life spent in the unflinching company of the unconscious, in which he observes something that every person who has lived through the experience described in this video will recognize as immediately and precisely true. He wrote that the most terrifying thing is to accept oneself completely, that the acceptance of the shadow, of the whole of what one is, including the parts that were formed in the service of others, including the wounds and the distortions, and the persona that was built around survival rather than truth, is the most demanding act the human psyche can perform. But he also understood, and this is the part that matters most, that the psyche moves toward this acceptance naturally if it is allowed to, that the shadow, the unconscious, the deep self are not enemies to be defeated or liabilities to be managed. They are allies that have been waiting in the dark for the ego to become strong enough to turn and face them. The 13 traits described in this video are not flaws. They are the record of a psychic structure that was built under specific conditions, for specific reasons, and that has been performing a specific and exhausting function, often for decades, without the knowledge or acknowledgement of the person living inside it. The person watching this video is not broken. They are loaded. There is a difference. And the difference is everything. A broken thing cannot be repaired, but a loaded thing, a psyche carrying what does not belong to it, can be unloaded. Not quickly, not painlessly, but genuinely, irreversibly, with a completeness that transforms not only what is felt, but who one understands oneself to be. The process begins tonight, not with a grand gesture, not with a dramatic confrontation, or a severing of ties, or any of the theatrical acts that tend to accompany the beginning of psychological awakening in its more performative iterations. It begins with a question. Sitting quietly, perhaps with this video still resonating somewhere in the chest, and asking, what am I carrying that is not mine? Not to receive an immediate answer. The unconscious does not work on the clock of the rational mind. Jung understood that the unconscious communicates in its own time through its own channels, dreams, symptoms, synchronicities, those moments of inexplicable recognition that arrive when the mind is quiet enough to notice them. But the question, once asked in genuine seriousness, changes something in the psychic atmosphere. It signals to the unconscious that the conscious mind is ready to begin receiving what has been waiting to be seen. And the unconscious, which is not hostile and not foreign, which is in fact the deeper and larger part of the very self that is asking, responds. This is what Jung meant when he described individuation as a homecoming, not a journey to somewhere new, a return to the self that was always present, that was never entirely lost, that was buried beneath the accumulated weight of other people's shadows and the personae built to manage the carrying of them. The homecoming does not erase the history. It does not undo the years of carrying. It does not remove the sensitivity or close the permeability or make the person into someone with volsals where they once had windows. What it does, and this is the transformation that those who have undergone it describe as the most significant event of their inner lives, is change the relationship between the carrier and the material they carry. It introduces a new axis of consciousness, a place inside from which what is absorbed can be observed before it is identified with, a stable ground from which the psyche can, say, with neither rejection nor collapse, "This is what is moving through me, and it is not all mine." That ground is what Jung called the self, not the small self of the ego, which is merely the conscious portion of the psyche's total reality, the larger self, the center of the whole psychic system, conscious and unconscious together. The still point that holds without being crushed, that receives without being replaced, that accompanies without being absorbed. This is what is trying to awaken in you. It has been said, in spiritual traditions far older than Jung and in the clinical language of depth psychology alike, that the most gifted carriers of human darkness are the ones who suffered it earliest, that the wound which produced the permeability also produced the depth, that you cannot have the gift without having first been broken open in exactly the right place. This is not comfort offered cheaply. This is the pattern that recurs across mythologies, across initiatory traditions, across the clinical records of analysts who have sat with thousands of individuating psyches across the last century. The one who carries the shadows is always, in the end, the one who was being prepared to transform them, not for the world, not as a mission or a calling or a role to be performed, for themselves. Because the individuation process is, and Jung was unequivocal about this, fundamentally personal before it is anything else. The transformation of the shadow carrier into the integrated wounded healer is first and foremost an act of self-recovery, of the psyche reclaiming what it was never meant to surrender, what becomes available to others, the warmth, the depth, the capacity to accompany suffering without being destroyed by it, is not the purpose of the process. It is the consequence, the gift that arrives after the work, not as a reward for the work, but as the natural outpourings of a psyche that has come into genuine relationship with its own wholeness. Here, then, is the line that this entire video has been building toward, the single sentence that should be written on the wall of every psyche that has spent too many years in the darkness of another person's shadow. You were not born to carry what others refused to face. You were born to become so thoroughly yourself that carrying it would finally become impossible. That is the end point of the individuation process as Jung understood it. Not a person without shadow, not a person immune to pain, a person so fully inhabited, so genuinely present in their own psychic center, that the automatic, unconscious, exhausting absorption of what others expel simply ceases to operate. Because where there is true selfhood, projection finds no purchase. Where there is genuine psychological differentiation, the participation mystique cannot take hold. This is not a state to be achieved and then rested in. It is a direction, a practice, a daily return to the question of what is mine and what was given to me by someone who could not hold it themselves. The work continues. It always continues. Jung wrote into his 90s and said, at the end, that he still did not fully understand what was happening in the depths of the psyche. That is not a failure of the greatest psychological mind of the 20th century. It is a testimony to the inexhaustibility of the inner life, to the fact that the unconscious is not a problem to be solved, but a relationship to be sustained. And you, whoever is watching this, wherever you are, whatever specific weight you have been carrying, in whatever specific configuration of relationships and histories produced it, you have already begun. The willingness to hear this, to sit with it, to feel the particular recognition that comes when something true is said about the inner life you have been living in silence. That willingness is itself a form of the turning. The psyche is moving. The work is alive in you. If this video spoke to something you have been carrying alone, something you didn't have the language for until tonight, please leave a like. It is a small act that carries the work forward, that ensures this kind of depth reaches the people who need it most. Subscribe if you want to continue this journey. The next video will go somewhere even deeper, into the specific moment the shadow carrier finally stops, the moment the weight drops, and what Jung said happens in the psyche when the long unconscious labor finally ends. That moment has a name, and it is not what most people expect. The next video will take you there,